As a seasoned mastering and vinyl cutting engineer, I've made it my mission to help musicians, producers and audio engineers understand the dark arts of mastering, and especially the art of mastering for and cutting to vinyl. I cut records every single day here at the studio on these machines, so I've got tons of experience, and I keep seeing these three same myths about mastering for vinyl crop up on the internet. So I thought I'd set the record straight, see what I did there, and get to the bottom of these myths so that you can get better sounding masters and better sounding records. So you might be surprised to learn that most mastering engineers have never even seen a record cutting lathe, let alone actually stood and cut a record. And it's this lack of first-hand experience that has led to these myths about vinyl mastering being so widespread. Understanding these myths and the processes around mastering for vinyl is really important for getting great vinyl masters and also for getting great sounding records. So let's dive in and get to the truth behind some of these vinyl mastering myths. Myth number one: always mono your low end. Now this is probably the most common of all the vinyl mastering myths, and you've probably already heard it, that when you're mastering for vinyl, you should be making your low end below 150 or 200 or 300 hertz should always be mono. And a lot of engineers have seen or read or heard this and now just take it as gospel that it's a blanket rule that you should apply to every single project, and that is wrong. It's a myth. Now, it is helpful in some situations, even a lot of situations, but it should never be taken as just a blanket rule, because there are lots of situations where maintaining the integrity of this stereo field and maintaining some low end in the stereo field as well is actually really important and key to the music. And if you were to just blindly mono the low end on some projects, you would be compromising the integrity of the recording, of the mix, and of the authenticity and the artistic vision behind the actual music. So here's some examples of when not to mono your low end, and these examples also serve as a sort of reminder that this isn't just a one-size-fits-all blanket rule for every project when it comes to mastering for vinyl. So firstly, let's talk about classical music and an orchestra. Now, if you can, picture in your mind how an orchestra is laid out. So imagine you're looking at an orchestra as an audience member. The double basses and the cellos are usually off way over to the right, and the double basses are up back in the far corner. And classical recording engineers use elaborate miking techniques, huge, big, tall mic stands and decatries to really try and capture the authentic essence of what it would be like to stand in front of an orchestra. So they're really trying to capture that stereo field where some instruments are way over here, some are way over there. So as you listen to it, you should feel like you're sat in front of the orchestra, hearing where all those instruments are in the stereo field. And with the double basses being way over to one side, imagine if you just blindly monoed everything below 300 hertz and put that in the center and got rid of any low end information, then you'd be losing some double bass, some cellos, you'd lose stuff from some strings over on the other side, and you'd really kind of alter how the orchestra is sounding, which is kind of undoing all the hard work of the recording engineer who spends lots of time and effort and energy into really getting that stereo image correct. And the same thing applies to smaller ensembles like maybe a jazz quartet or quintet or a trio, where the instruments are very deliberately placed in certain positions in the stereo field. You might have a piano slightly off to one side, you might have a bass player off to one side and a drummer in the middle, for instance, or you might have strings, or excuse me, you might have a string player or a sax player or a baritone player, again off to one side. And that's really deliberate. The placement is very deliberate for a sense of separation of the instruments and also a sense of how the band would feel live. Lots of other world music is also recorded in the same way. Indian classical music, flamenco music, and then moving over to Asia, Indonesian gamelan, which has a lot of drums and drones spread really wide over the stereo field. There's a lot of intention behind the placement of instruments, and that's far more important than just being super loud. As with sort of more pop orientated genres, it's a very different intention. So there are some examples of when and why you don't always need to mono your low end. Sometimes you want a bass to be off to one side slightly. Sometimes that's intentional. And if you were to just blindly mono the low end, you'd ruin the integrity of the recording. But why does this myth keep persisting? Well, it is actually important for some genres, even a lot of genres, especially more modern, louder ones, especially pop, especially dance music with big 4/4 kick drums, bass heavy music, even more sort of louder guitar, rock based stuff as well. But there's always a compromise and there's always a trade-off. So if you do want to maintain the wide stereo image and you want some low end out on the sides and you don't want to mono the low end, that comes with the trade-off that we have to lower the overall volume of the cut so you don't get a loud vinyl, but you will get a more open, dynamic sounding record, which can preserve some low end on the sides of the stereo image. But if you wanted a louder cut, like a lot of genres do, especially like the dance and electronic stuff, then we can mono the low end, and that will actually help get you a louder overall cut. And this is because of how a cutting stylus works. So I'll do a quick explanation of that, just so you can sort of get your head around how a cutting stylus works and why stereo low end can be a problem in some situations, and why using an elliptical filter or an EQ to mono your low end actually does work in a lot of situations as well. So when a cutting stylus is actually cutting the groove into a record, it's moving up and down and left to right at the same time. Now the left to right motion is cutting the in phase or the mono signal, and the up and down motion or the vertical motion is cutting the out of phase or the side information of the signal. And the way a cutting head works is quite a lot like how a speaker cone would work. So it's vibrating back and forth, and for higher frequencies it's vibrating faster, but it's not moving as much. It's kind of not moving back and forth as much, but it's moving faster. And the lower the frequency gets, the slower it moves back and forth, but the wider it moves. So it's going like that. So if you imagine the cutting stylus is up and down and left and right, for the stereo information, it's moving up and down. So for the higher frequencies, it's moving faster, but it's not moving as far. And for the lower information, it's moving slower, but it's moving further. And what can happen with that stereo low end is, if it moves too far, the cutting stylus will actually jump off the surface of the record that it's cutting, and then the groove will have a bit that's just left out. The groove will disappear. And obviously if that happens, then the record is no good. It's unlistenable because the playback arm won't be able to track it. So this is why the monoing your low end advice is out there. If you have too much stereo low end and it's too loud, the cutting stylus will jump off the record and actually lose the groove. So to combat that, we can just get rid of the stereo information on the low end, so it's not going to jump off the record. Or if we want to keep that stereo information, the up and down information, in the low end, what we can do is just bring down the overall volume, and that makes sure the cutting stylus, which is moving up and down and left and right, just doesn't move as far in any direction. So the more volume you put into a cutting head, the more the cutting stylus moves up and down and left and right. And that has an effect on the volume when you're playing back the record. So I hope that makes sense. You can have stereo information, but the overall record will be quieter. Or if you want a loud bass, then you can mono it, and that helps with the cutting stylus movement. So we can get a louder cut, but it has to be in mono. So there you go. So we can have stereo information, but we've got to be careful with it. And if you're ever unsure about this, the best thing to do is ask your pressing plant or ask your cutting engineer. And if you can't speak to them directly, leave some notes on your PQ sheet and say either, I have stereo low end, so please reduce the volume accordingly, or this wants to be really loud, so please make sure the low end is mono. Whichever you're going for, tell the cutting engineer and they'll be able to accommodate that. So moving on to myth 2, and that is that you should never use any limiting or compression when you're making vinyl masters. So again, this is another myth that I keep hearing and seeing, is that you should remove all limiting and remove all compression if you're mastering for vinyl. And this again can really affect the sound, because most people are mixing into a compressor anyway, and it's becoming increasingly common to even mix into a limiter these days. It didn't used to be as common, but now I get a lot of projects where people have put a limiter on their mix bus and they're intentionally mixing into that because they like the way it sounds, they like the glue that it's giving, and they like the dynamic control as well. Again, especially for louder genres of music. So let's look at compression first. And compression is actually, I find, the key to a really good sounding vinyl master. I always use a compressor when doing my vinyl masters, partly for control, dynamic control, and partly for tone, and partly for glue as well. Vinyl responds really well to a wider dynamic range, but we still need some level of control, and that's where compression can really help. A compressor can really help level your overall tracks while providing a bit of glue that we all like the sound of. And with carefully selected attack and release times, it can also really help the dynamics and the feel of energy and life of a track as well. Something which I never hear talked about is attack and release times for compressors for vinyl mastering. And I found, after doing thousands and thousands of cuts and masters for vinyl, that attack and release times are really key to getting a really good record that has loads of energy and life to it. If you can get your attack times right, and you can get the balance between controlling transients without really squashing them, then that can translate really well to vinyl, and it sounds almost like the sound is leaping off the speakers, it's springing forward off your speakers. Whereas if you get the compression wrong and attack times are a bit too fast and clamping down on transients, it almost sounds like there's a bit of a blanket over the sound. And to me, it sounds like the sound is like being pushed from behind out of the speakers rather than just springing and leaping off the speaker cones. It's quite hard to put into words, but you know it when you hear it, where a record has just got life and energy to it. And for me, and from my experience, a lot of that has to do with your compression settings, getting the attack times right. So you don't want the attack too fast, or it's going to just clamp down on every transient, and things are going to sound a bit too constrained. And if the attack time is too slow, it's going to let through too much of the attack of transients, and you're going to lose the control, and you're going to have less consistent headroom. And if you had a bigger spike at some point during a song, that might even lead to some distortion on playback as well. So you've got to get the balance of that really, really it's got to be done really carefully. And the same with release times as well. You've got to get your release time dialed into the rhythm of the track so you don't get any pumping. And if you can get those two right and get a nice energetic sounding master where you still have some level of dynamic control, so you've got a nice even track without some bits being really loud and some bits being too quiet, then you're going to get really great, lively, energetic sounding record. So now let's talk about limiters in vinyl mastering. Now the myth is that you should never use a limiter, always take the limiter off, but they can actually be useful in some situations. Now I don't use a limiter too much in vinyl mastering, but when I'm cutting, I pretty much always have one on the end of the chain just to catch any rogue peaks. So they can actually be really useful. Now the way I would use a limiter in my vinyl masters is really as a bit of a safety thing. So I'm going to put a limiter on the very end, and that's just going to be there to catch any rogue peaks that might occur. I don't really want it working most of the time. It's just there to catch the odd peak and bring that down. And I would use it so that it's really nice and transparent. So I'd use a transparent sounding limiter. And again, not really doing much, but just catching the odd peak. And that will allow me to get a nice loud cut. And imagine if you had a track where it's fairly consistent, volume and dynamic sort of wise most of the time, but then there's a section or there's a part where there's a bit of a peak and it jumps up a bit. If you didn't have something to control that, then the cutting engineer might just bring the overall level of that track down because those loud peaks might cause some distortion when cutting to a record. So again, it sort of helps just as a safety thing, just there to catch any loud peaks. So you can get an overall louder cut and you know it's going to be safe from any little peaks or distortion and stuff like that. Now there are situations where, again, like I mentioned before, people actually mix into a limiter and people want that sound. So maybe that's the sound of the record, of the tune, of the song, and that's kind of the intention behind it. And removing the limiter might sort of really alter the overall sound of the mix, and that's not what the artist wants. So in that case, sure, leave the limiter on. Again, tell your cutting engineer, this has limiting on, it's intentional, I want it like that, please cut it as best you can. And it can be done. There's it's not always best practice to cut really squared off waveforms. Most of the time, they don't sound as good as a more dynamic waveform, but it can be done. And again, if that's the intention behind the music and it's intentionally loud, then that can be cut to a record. So there you go. So that's the myth about dynamics. The myth, again, is that you should never use a limiter and don't use too much compression and stuff like that. But you can, especially compression, I think is a great tool for creating really good vinyl masters. And limiters are really good just as more of a safety thing. And like I just said, if the intention behind the music is to have a loud, aggressive sound, then by all means, leave the limiter on, tell your cutting engineer, and they'll be able to cut that music the way you want it. So let's move on to myth number 3, and that is that the mastering engineer's audio is the final product. So even the term a vinyl master is kind of misleading, because what a mastering engineer provides is not really the master, it's the pre-master. And a lot of work will actually be done by the cutting engineer to make that pre-master suitable for cutting. You can think of the pre-master as more of a starting point for the cutting engineer, and the cutting engineer is always trying to cut as close as they can to that, but what they'll do is use their experience and their knowledge of their cutting lathe and their cutting head to make sure that that actually translates well onto the vinyl. A lot of the time, the pre-master that a mastering engineer provides will need some degree of work. The cutting engineer will definitely look at the stereo width of the low end. He'll look at the high end, the sibilance, and also look at the dynamics of the overall track as well, and see if there's anything there that needs correcting or just needs a little tweak so that it will get a lot better result when it's cut to vinyl. Really, the myth here that I'm trying to clear up is that your vinyl master, which really should be called a pre-master, is not going to be the exact same as. So really the myth that I'm trying to clear up here is that the vinyl master, which really should be called a pre-master file that you'll hear before it's sent to the pressing plant or the cutting engineer, is not going to be exactly the same as the record. The sound of the record is going to differ slightly from the vinyl pre-master that you heard before it went off to be cut. And the cutting engineer really is there to do sometimes a lot of heavy lifting in that area, or sometimes the pre-master might be bang on, it might be great, and the pre-master might sound really super close to the finished record, nearly indistinguishable, which is really the aim. But sometimes that vinyl pre-master might need a bit of work and a bit of EQ and dynamic sort of sculpting to get it sounding really good. So you might get your record back and go, hang on a minute, this doesn't sound quite like the master that I heard. And that's because it might just have needed a few tweaks so that it sounds really good when it's played back off a record. And there's only really one way to do that. Even a mastering engineer with loads of experience, if they've never actually cut a record, they might provide great vinyl pre-masters, but there's only one way to tell if it's going to sound good on vinyl, and that's to do a test cut. And that's what a cutting engineer will do. They'll do a little test cut of the pre-master and listen back to it and then make any adjustments. So the pre-master is never the final sound of the record. It's really, hopefully it is, but there's always room for things to change and improve so that we know we're going to get a good sounding record. And this is why getting a test cut is so essential. If you're an artist or a producer or engineer who's involved in getting some vinyl made, always get a test cut. Because like I've said, the pre-master might change, hopefully not very much, but it might change when it's actually being cut to a record. So always get a test cut before you go ahead with getting several hundred copies made, and make sure you're happy with how the test cut sounds. And if you're not, then you can talk to the cutting engineer, talk to your mastering engineer, and then make some adjustments to get the sound that you want and the product that you want. So there you go. Vinyl masters should be called pre-masters, and they're going to change when they actually get onto the record. So be prepared for that. And again, like a great piece of advice is just to talk to your cutting engineer or pressing plant as much as you can. Now, in some instances, you can't really. Some of the bigger plants, it's just kind of click, send your files off and get your boxes of vinyl back 6 months later, which is unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. So if you can find independent cutting engineers and smaller pressing plants near you, they're often the ones that are really good at communicating so that you can actually speak to people, ask any questions and get advice on how to get the best sounding records. So there we go. That's the 3 big vinyl myths that I keep hearing that we've debunked, or I don't really like that word, cleared up a little bit today. So hopefully that's helped you understand the whole process a little bit better, and also helped you kind of get your head around why you shouldn't always listen to these rules. If you hear a rule that says always do this to this, it's probably not true. Every piece of music is individual. Everything has specific needs. And like we've talked about, a classical recording is going to need very different treatment to like a pop music recording or a techno recording. You know, they're very different, and we can have very different stereo fields, different dynamic expression, different types of or different degrees of limiting and all that kind of stuff. And also there can be varying degrees of how different the pre-master will sound to the finished product, to the finished vinyl. So take any rule you hear out there on the internet, always take it with a pinch of salt, and where you can, talk to whoever's doing the thing that they are doing. Did that make sense? Yeah. If you're getting vinyl cut, talk to a cutting engineer. Don't listen to advice from some kid on TikTok or YouTube. And again, if you're getting vinyl pressed, talk to the pressing plant. Don't just take advice that you hear or that someone else has told you. Because especially with vinyl, there's so much room for nuance, and there's so many different techniques we can use. And it really comes down to every single project needs something different. That's why us cutting engineers do loads and loads of test cuts. I've got a pile of records about this big over there that are just test cuts. They'll never be sent off to anyone. They're just test cuts, because every project that comes in, the only way to really know if it's going to work is to cut it to a disc and listen back. So there we go. I'll stop rambling. I hope that's been helpful for you. As always, if you've got any questions about mastering, cutting to vinyl, then leave them down in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks for listening. Hope you're well, and I'll see you next time.